Well, hello and welcome. You're watching The Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. Of course, the show where we take a look at some of the big stories that's been happening throughout the week and, of course, that has kept South Africans talking. Let's take a look at some of your headlines, perhaps before we get into what your top stories are for this Week in Review. Obviously, the fighting continues across the Ukraine, and this, of course, follows Russia's invasion. Closer to home, South Africa is now recording another 2,111 cases of COVID-19. And then on the sporting front, Luvuyo Mamela's goal gave AmaZulu a 1-0 win over the Algerian club ES Setif in a CAF Champions League Group B match in Durban. As we continue to shine a spotlight on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa says the United Nations Security Council needs to engage more in the escalating conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. The Council is expected to convene an urgent meeting later today where member states will vote on a resolution calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Ukraine. President Ramaphosa insists that the conflict should be resolved through mediation.
This mediation approach seems to be losing its effectiveness. I mean, we can see now the war that is going on in the Ukraine, and I would say that that conflict is a conflict that should be subjected to mediation, to negotiation, to engagement, because it is not necessary for people to go to war and have people getting killed, infrastructure being damaged as it is now. And it behoves on the countries of the world, particularly the United Nations Security Council. They are the ones who should be getting more and more engaged in a mediation process. And one does not see that happening. One does not see that full engagement. And it is this that I believe should happen to bring the hostilities to an end. That is precisely what needs to be done in that type of situation. Because it is not necessary for people to die and to be killed when the option of mediation, when the option of negotiation and engagement is available.
Well, since that meeting, of course, Russia vetoing the United Nations Security Council resolution on the war against the Ukraine, a developing story that we'll continue to explore here on the SABC. In other news, perhaps also related to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, commodity prices continue to surge as the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine escalates. Economists say that a spike in palladium prices could benefit local mining companies such as Sibanye-Stillwater. But the company is the world's second largest primary producer of palladium and the third largest producer of gold.
Russia and South Africa are the largest producers of palladium. Russia has now been hit with sanctions over its intensifying tensions with Ukraine, preventing its mining companies to enter the palladium market. Palladium is used in catalytic converters. Now, local mining company Sibanye seems poised to benefit from this crisis. The price of this precious metal has hit a record high of $2,500 an ounce as demand rises. Chief economist at the Minerals Council of South Africa, Hank Langehoven, says the country's dollar price index for gold, iron ore, coal and platinum have already moved by at least 50%. And this is mainly driven by supply uncertainty around the world.
The situation in Russia, because they're such a big supplier of minerals worldwide, will have an impact on the supply of minerals in the world and will add to the uncertainty around the demand for minerals, because the prices will certainly move. What we've seen in January and February is that the dollar price index for the important South African minerals, which is gold, iron ore, coal, and platinum, has already moved by something like 50%. So mainly driven by the uncertainty around the technology and where the demand will go in terms of the new green economy. And this further uncertainty around supply of all sorts of minerals will certainly contribute to the uncertainty and therefore to the prices rising faster than what one would have expected. So it would be definitely beneficial for South Africa, seeing that we have this large group of platinum group metals at least, but also gold as a hedge against uncertainty will probably benefit from this.
Mining Director at Mergence Corporate Solutions, Peter Major, says these tensions spell good news for South African mineral companies.
Russia produces almost half the world's palladium. We can see it shooting up. But why did rhodium shoot up when South Africa produces most of it, 90%? Anyways, I don't think the platinum producers are complaining. They're getting close to record high metal prices again. And this country's sure not going to complain after seeing that last budget, how mining added about 170 billion that we wouldn't have had without this commodity boom. In a perverse, sad way, this trouble with Russia, the Ukraine, and the rest of the world, it's been more of a plus for South Africa than a negative.
In the first 2 months of the year, South Africa's minerals have already seen growth. And with the continued tensions in Russia, this can only spell good news for the country's minerals. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for more on the story, I'm joined by international relations consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala. Very good afternoon to you, Dr. Charles Sinkala. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC today. All right, Dr. Charles, I'm just going to ask you to unmute your mic.
My apologies for that. Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon to your viewers.
Thank you very much. Let's get straight into it. Russia, the latest emerging from the meeting last night, Russia vetoing the United Nations Security Council resolution on the war against the Ukraine. But to better understand the geopolitics behind all of this and also perhaps the global contingencies and consequences of the war for Russia and Ukraine, what is on the cards geopolitically and economically?
Lizzo, thank you so much. Important that one we must understand what's at the basis of the
All right, Dr. Charles Sinkala, it seems like we do have some technical issues with your connection. Let's perhaps try to get you back on the line via telephone whilst that's sorted out. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines at this hour. In fact, we'll take a quick ad break and continue with this discussion on the other side. Do stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. You're watching the Weekend Review. Let's continue with more stories at this hour, perhaps before we get back into the discussion highlighting the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Now, in South Africa, we've seen premiers delivering their State of the Province addresses this week, with pressure mounting on the Limpopo Premier Stan Mathabata to implement, obviously, recommendations of the SIU report on his provincial health department. Now, delivering his SOPA, Mathabata said that those implicated in the report will be held accountable. Political parties have expressed mixed feelings after Mpumalanga Premier Refiwe Mtsweni Mtsipane delivered her SOPA, in which she announced, in fact, new interventions and programs aimed at improving the lives of residents, stimulating the province's economy and creating jobs. The IFPs described KwaZulu-Natal Premier Sihle Zikalala's SOPA as short-sighted and a repetition of old promises. Now, amongst other things, Zikalala has promised to deal with the water problem in areas in the north of the province and the south coast. Opposition parties within the Northwest Legislature have described the SOPA by Northwest Premier Bushi Mape as disappointing and lacking inspiration. Moving on to the Northern Cape, perhaps, opposition parties also coming out to say that SOPA delivered by Premier Zamani Sol was a repetition of empty promises he's made in previous years. Also, locally, all eyes were on Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana for his maiden budget speech this week. It was generally welcomed by various stakeholders, although some had hoped for more from the national purse. Take a look.
The budget speech gives the finance minister an opportunity to outline government's estimated expenditure and revenue collection in the coming year and how government hopes to fund the deficit. This week's budget was tabled against the backdrop of much stronger tax revenue collections. It's expected to be 62 billion rand higher than estimated 4 months ago. This gave Godongwana room to provide relief in personal income and corporate taxes.
Households are still under financial pressure and are coping with higher obligations, the effects of COVID-19 and increased fuel prices. Now is not the time to increase taxes and put the recovery at risk. Accordingly, we have decided to keep money in the pockets of South Africans.
He also increased the social grants.
For 2022-23 fiscal year, the old age, war veterans, disability and care dependence grants will increase by 90 rand in October. The foster care and child support grants will increase by a once-off 20 rand in April. Thirdly, 44 billion rand is allocated for a 12-month extension of the 350 social relief grant, total distress grant.
The budget drew mixed reactions from political parties. Some were satisfied with the allocations, while others believe the budget did not address fiscal challenges facing the country. Meanwhile, the National House of Traditional and Khoisan Leaders was opened on Thursday by Deputy President David Mabuza. He called on traditional leaders to fight the scourge of ritual killings and tribalism.
The role of traditional leaders should never be limited only to ceremonial and cultural responsibilities, but should be seen in the broader context of daily struggles of ordinary people in search for a better life.
MPs also dealt with the issue of racial classification. This follows a petition by a group which calls itself the People Against Race Classification. The group wants the word colored to be expunged from all official records and from the Employment Equity Act, saying the classification is offensive, derogatory, and racist.
What I want the committee to do, they must focus on the word rename, amend the race block. So African must change to black, colored should be removed, the other blocks should be included with the race blocks. They should amend the Employment Equity Act, the race blocks.
On the international front, government says it stands ready to assist Libya as that country struggles to maintain political stability, but will not impose its will on Libyans.
We respect the individual country's sovereignty and all what we are doing, especially the lobbying that we are doing to the stakeholders in Libya. We respect that at the end of the day is the Libyan themselves that need to take a decision. So we have got no right to push our ideas accordingly, because our relations definitely is a mutual one.
Lula Mamatya, SABC News, Parliament.
Right, continuing with our story earlier on, we are now joined by international relations consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala, again highlighting the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Dr. Charles, I believe you're back on the line. Let's just pick up where we left off. Obviously, last night we heard Russia vetoing the United Nations Security Council resolution on the war against Ukraine. But to perhaps better understand the geopolitics behind all of this and the global contingencies and consequences of the war for Russia and the Ukraine, what's on the cards geopolitically and economically?
Yes, thank you very much once again. You see, there's quite a lot of misinformation on the media and elsewhere. And as well as we've got so many moving parts, from the EU, NATO, West, and the United States of America, and as well as the economical platform, regarding the war in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine in terms of moving forward. The United Nations Security Council, where Russia is part of it, and most of the European countries, including the United States of America, they have actually failed, the people of the both people's two countries, in terms of taking a diplomatic dialogue, to subject it to mediation and mitigate the risk of the loss of lives. But for now, it's a bit too late for the United Nations Security Council, as Russia, they have the power of veto on any decisions that the United Nations can make, in terms of war within their territory. And both sides, Ukraine and Russia, they've got different type of stories from either side. Earlier this morning, I had a very good conversation with the ambassador to South Africa from Ukraine. She also cites some grievances, and they think that Russia is invading their place.
Okay, so Dr. Charles, on the back of what you're saying, I want to now pick up on South Africa's involvement in BRICS and the alliances that also have, obviously come from that. South Africa forms part of BRICS, which is an intergovernmental organization. And as we know, it includes Brazil, Russia, India, and China, obviously also South Africa. So when we look at the formality of the alliances and what's at stake, particularly after South Africa issued a statement, announcing that Russia should withdraw from the Ukraine out of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the states, calling for diplomacy to prevail, obviously following a previous DIRCO statement which had called for both sides to exercise restraint and pursue dialogue. So then, just given South Africa's stance post what the minister, Naledi Pandor, has remarked to date about South Africa, what concerns are also amounting for those in BRICS, perhaps who do not endorse Russia?
Yes, indeed. To myself, I believe President Cyril Ramaphosa's statement regarding Russia to withdraw, it's unthought for, and it does not conform to the BRICS agreement to support those countries who are in the BRICS region, and as well as it is more of siding with Ukraine rather than taking up a mutual independent position to call for the both parties to look at this situation and handle it in a diplomatic way. You must remember that for every conflict, there's always two sides of the story, and both of them, they've got, in their view, they've got valid information for them to participate in that territory. Talking about the territorial control in law and as well as in the military space, there's a certain territory and the jurisdiction one cannot invade or one cannot take up without the knowledge of the other part. I can give an example of the airspace. The airspace is controlled by different countries, and once one does not have permission, they've got the right to shoot down that plane. I remember very well my country, Zambia, in 1992, soccer players, 23 of them in the coast of Libreville in Gabon, they used a military plane without communication, and it was shot down. So we need also to look at those proximity where, Russia has failed to be intimidated within his neighboring countries, that the escalation and the militarizing of Ukraine poses a very big danger to them. in terms of military security. But again, we can see that going to trade, Russia risks losing the relationship with Ukraine, because Ukraine is very important in terms of trade, because they've got access all season through the Black Sea to trade through the ships, as the North Atlantic on top there becomes frozen in winter.
Dr. Charles, given South Africa's relationship with the USSR, to date, what is the impact of South Africa's, stance towards its relationship with Russia, and how will the Ukraine crisis actually impact South Africa going forward? How is it also going to impact on, democratic practices that we uphold this side, whilst we reflect on what's happening on the end?
Yes, Lizzo, like we know, Africa, which is mostly represented by South Africa, the relations won't look so good, going forward, especially from the speech from South Africa, regarding asking Russia to withdraw without due consideration or taking a neutral point. Russia has got, a seat in the United Nations Security Council. And in relation to African affairs and security affairs, Russia, helps Africa in going forward. So taking up a fight, a diplomatic fight with Russia wouldn't be a bad idea. It will be, have a very big impact in terms of peace and security as well as trade. We can see that already in the African continent, the trading partners have decided to escalate some prices due to the wars that are going on in Russia and Ukraine. I think the only solution for Russia and Ukraine to become mutually understandable is like what the Russian President Putin has been mentioning, that the negotiations on diplomatic negotiations and dialogue has to be based on the interest of both the peoples of Ukraine and Russia rather than the West. As well, we can see there the interest of the European Union to have Ukraine added, and as well as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as the interest of the United States of America. We all understand that the third law of conflict is that there is a third party involved with every conflict. And if we look at the United States of America's reference in terms of military involvement or invasion, we can just talk about a few in Iran, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, where they accused Saddam Hussein that he had weapons of mass destruction and totally destroyed the country, and without any sanctions to the United Nations or the United States of America itself. But with the case of Russia, it's completely something different, where we see casualties and people are dying without hope of being protected by the United Nations.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. I'm also looking at how interesting it is to note that China and India, abstained from yesterday's UN Security Council resolution vote. Why do you think that also transpired? What's emerging on that front too?
Of course, China's proximity as well is not far away from Russia, and they always need to keep a good neighboring manners or relations. In that matter, China is a very good partner to Russia in terms of military and as well as bilateral and multilateral involvement. And they wouldn't take up a step to support another country that will jeopardize their relationship. We can see as well the position by the president from Turkey, who Ukraine approached to say that they shouldn't allow them to deploy their military vessels in the Turkish borders. They have the treaty which they have signed already with Russia. And, we need also to understand that the relationship between Russia and Ukraine goes back dates many years ago, where they signed the treaties. And, those treaties should hold the ones President Putin has highlighted, that because of those treaties, Ukraine is actually shouldn't be advancing towards the borders. And, talking about the borders, one will think that the border is only on the Russian side, but there is a geographical area where the military escalation or presence shouldn't be from both sides of the two countries.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Charles, it is, of course, a developing story. And as we monitor the latest emerging, I want to thank you very much for your time. Again, International Relations Consultant Dr. Charles Sinkala, again, chatting to us about the latest involving the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We obviously have observed that Russia vetoed a draft UN Security Council resolution on Friday, whilst China and India abstained from the vote. Again, we await to see the impact of these dynamics unfolding for the world. On news closer to home now, National Police Commissioner Ketla Sithole will leave his post at the end of March after being axed by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Sithole and Police Minister Bheki Cele have been at loggerheads over who's to blame for the July unrest that led to the deaths of about 350 people in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng last year. Well, the presidency announced Sithole's sacking, saying it was in the interests of the nation.
This is with effect from the 31st of March 2022. President Ramaphosa and the General have agreed that the early termination of the Commissioner's contract is in the best interests of the country. The time until General Sithole's departure will enable a proper handover of various tasks, including all ongoing investigations, to one of the senior members of the team at the South African Police Service, who has been assisting General Sithole. The President has expressed his appreciation to General Sithole for the constructive discussions they have had over the termination of the General's position as National Commissioner. And the President also conveys his appreciation to the General for his service to the nation over many years in the South African Police Service and wishes him the best in his future endeavours. An announcement will be made in due course on filling the position of the National Commissioner following General Sithole's departure.
Let's leave it for you. Let's leave it there for you today. Again, tomorrow we'll be back with a look at the week ahead. From myself, Liesl Wilson, and the Week in Review team. Until tomorrow, it's goodbye for now.